Hi there, I'm Stacey Barr. I'm a performance measurement and evidence-based leadership specialist, and with me is Nick Deborah, who is a data visualization and dashboard design expert. We want to share a collaboration that we've done with you on how to design one of the most powerful visualizations, I believe, for tracking KPIs or performance measures over time so that they can drive the biggest performance improvements possible. Now, we're going to start just with a tiny bit of background. So almost three decades ago, I created a performance measurement methodology called PUMP. Now, PUMP is used all around the world. It is used in every sector, hundreds of industries and thousands of organizations. And it's designed to solve the challenges, I guess, of performance measurement, particularly in strategy execution, that are common to every industry or sector. Now, any organization can take the techniques of PUMP and work them into how they do strategic planning or strategy implementation or any type of performance improvement for that matter. And this chart type that Nick and I are playing with today is a pivotal part of how PUMP does that. So Nick, we met through our mutual friend and colleague, Stephen Few, who people will know from his many brilliant books on dashboard design and data visualization. That was a while ago now, Nick, hey?
Yeah, that we first met, yeah, must be in the, how, 4 or 5 years ago at least, something
Easily.
like that, pre-pandemic, the before times, yeah.
Yeah. So, Steve has since retired, and you've really carried on and built on Steve's work with your own talent and flair. And we're going to see that in full action in this video. So I reckon it's going to be fun.
Yeah, yeah, no, looking forward to it, absolutely, yeah.
Any more background you want to give before we get going?
Um, yeah, well, I guess, just for perhaps your audience that doesn't know who I am, I'm basically an independent instructor. I teach data visualization. I've done it in, 14, 15 countries, I think, up to now, data visualization and dashboard design. I have a couple of books, practical charts, more practical charts. There's going to be a dashboard book coming out next year.
I can't wait for that one. I have your first book, and it just rocked my world. I not only is the content just spot on, like really helpful and practical, but just the way you write, Nick, it just blew me away. Just how engaging the book is as an experience in using it. So yeah, well done. You've inspired me.
I certainly appreciate that. As you have with me. I mean, I took your course through Louise Watson, one of your uh,
Licensees.
instructors, and yeah, just changed my whole outlook. So, Mutual Appreciation Society.
Lovely. Not a bad way to start this little
Mhm.
collaboration too. Okay,
Mm.
so we have a few things that we're going to walk through. We're going to do a very brief overview of what an XMR chart is, just in case you've never heard of one. And it's not going to be an instruction about XMR charts, so there'll be plenty of information that we'll provide to support this video, so you can dive in a bit more deeply if you want to. We'll go over then the typical way that XMR charts have been designed. I call that design 1.0. We'll show you some examples and why they don't work. Then briefly how I collaborated with Stephen Few many years ago to come up with XMR chart design 2.0. And then we will spend the most of the time really diving into XMR chart design 3.0 with Nick's inspiration. So why XMR charts? I might just start briefly with that. This is not a video about PUMP, but the idea of using XMR charts for KPIs really is a pivotal part of the PUMP methodology. So PUMP is an 8-step process for choosing, implementing and using KPIs or performance measures, particularly for strategy execution. And it's step 6 in PUMP, where the XMR charts get built for each of our KPIs so that we can easily see signals of change, progress toward targets, and how things are tracking over time. Now, no other chart can really show the timing, the type, the size and the speed of changes that we're trying to make in performance than the XMR chart can. And they're also the only chart that makes it possible to measure quantitatively the impact of change initiatives. So they're greatly underestimated, in my opinion, and underused in management. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about an XMR chart. It's actually two charts that work together from the classic statistical theory behind them. The first part is the X chart, actually. And it's where we plot our measures' values in time series. This measure is customer complaints, and the values being plotted are the total number of complaints received each month. Now, most of the interpretation that we do comes from this first chart, the X chart, but there is a second part to the XmR, and it's called the MR chart. And it plots the amount of variation between our measure values along the same time series. The MR chart is only really important if you're going to go on and learn how to build the XMR charts. They are useful to a degree in decision making, but our focus today is going to be on design only. So we're going to ignore the MR chart and focus just on the X chart only. But just so that you know, together, the X and the MR chart make up the classic XmR chart. We're going to take a quick look at the X chart itself that Nick is going to soon do a redesign of. Often the X chart is still referred to as an XmR chart. That's more just so that we know the theory that it's come from. But knowing that there's an MR chart is important, even though you don't always see it. So I hope this isn't confusing. And we're, again, not here to teach these charts. There are a lot of links that will accompany this video so that you can learn more about the how-to and build them for yourself. But for now, just know that there are three essential parts of this X chart. And the first part is the measure values. In this case, we have the measure values for the actual number of customer complaints each month. The second part of the chart is the central line. It's basically like a performance baseline or the current level of performance, because current performance is not the most recent KPI value. The central line shows how performance is changing over time, which you can see in this example. The central line shifted down. That's an improvement in this measure. Now, the third piece is the natural process limits, that pale blue shaded area. They show us the upper and lower edges of the measure's natural amount of variation. So not necessarily changes to react to. This is just the natural amount of variation. It's how wide we could expect the measure values to vary if nothing really were to fundamentally change. These limits can change over time also. So if we go ahead and do an improvement to reduce customer complaints, get them under control, those natural process limits, that pale blue band, may actually get narrower. Now, in addition to these basic parts of an XmR chart, I like to add targets. In Pump, we use blue dots that represent the target value, where we want the central line to ultimately be from our improvement efforts. So I set the blue dots at the dates by which we'd like to reach those targets, and we can set targets for those upper and lower natural process limits as well if we want to. And the real power of these charts comes from how clearly they show us signals of change. Now, first and foremost, what the XmR charts show us is how much control we have over performance, or whether it's chaotic. In this case, performance is chaotic. It's not in our control. It's chopping all over the place, up and down. You can pick this up with your eye. You really don't need a statistical rule to test for it, but you have to fix this. If you are not in control of an area of performance, you can't successfully make any systematic improvements to it that are going to last. So once you have some level of control or stability over a KPI, you can then use the chart to find signals. And the first signal we call the long run, 8 or more measure values in a row on the same side of the central line. The next one is a short run, and this is where we look for at least 3 out of 4 measure values that are in a row on the same side of the central line, but they are closer to the natural process limit than to the central line. These are big shifts, big fast shifts in performance. And then the other signal we can see is an outlier. We look for a measure value that's basically fallen outside the natural process limits, but we make sure that the next 2 or 3 measure values that come after it return to normal. If they don't, then we probably have another form of a short run. But outliers, they just let us know when something abnormal happened, abnormal and atypical. Now, the design that you've been looking at so far, that we currently use in Pump, that was the one that Stephen Few helped create some years ago, but it's not the way most software apps produce these XmR charts. So there are different ways that the XMR charts are displayed, typically from various types of software. They're often visually unattractive, though. They'll use some of the old Microsoft Excel default color schemes that, well, I don't know, they probably come from the 1990s. I don't know. But they can also be quite misleading, where the colors that are used suggest thresholds or good or bad performance. But the parts of the XMR chart don't describe good or bad or should be performance. They just describe as is, what currently is. So without the right visual cues in these chart designs, it really can be hard to interpret the charts quickly and correctly, especially for decision makers who need the truth from their KPIs but just aren't trained in the XMR chart theory. So how these very special charts are designed is vitally important for how well they can be used to bring insight into decision making. And that's why I asked for Stephen Few's help originally all those years ago. Nick, you worked with Steve for a while. I think I recall.
Yeah, yeah. So I first went to one of his workshops in way back in 2013, and of course, just he completely blew my mind. And we ended up chatting for a few months, and then he graciously agreed, because I asked him if I could teach his courses, his workshops, which he then trained me to do for fairly kind of grueling 6 or 7 months, and then I ended up teaching those until about 2019, 2020, right up until the pandemic. And then Steve retired from teaching. He still writes, but I then started developing my own courses and books at that time as well.
I think he chose well with who would pick up his torch and keep it going.
Mm.
He's
Yeah.
a pretty special person to work with. I can't even remember how long ago I met him. I think it was even before 2013. I really don't remember the time. It just seems like I've known him for almost all of my career. He's just became friends pretty quickly as well. I think his thinking is so elegant, and he's another inspiration too for me. He actually
Oh yeah.
inspired me to write the first book that I wrote. So there you go.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Unsurprising. Yeah. Steve is pretty amazing.
Yeah, so everyone, Steve is pretty special, and he was great. He was a great sport in helping me redesign these XMR charts so that they could look clean and simple and visually pleasing. So here it is again. You can see how the clutter is all cleaned up. You can see how there's shading used to draw our eye to that range of normal variation without it being distracting. There are specific targets on the chart, not thresholds, so that we get a bit more information that way about where we want performance to be and by when. We also had agreed to reduce the dominance of the measure values line because we don't want to look at the individual measure values. We want to look at their patterns over time and how they're shifting. So the visual cue here is really that comparison between the central line and the target dots, and that's why they are the blue that stands out a bit more. We also added a bit of time, empty time on the end of the chart, especially for when targets kind of sit further into the future like that. So we kind of got a sense of how much time is left for us to make an improvement to ideally reach the next target. So this is how, Nick, as you're well aware, how we've been using XMR charts in Pump ever since. But now that I
Mhm.
know you, Nick, and I love your very uniquely practical and iterative style with designing data visualizations, it just seems only natural to see how you might look at an XMR chart to design them so that they can better fulfill their purpose. And how about we do that now, Nick?
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, and obviously, this is quite a well designed chart. I mean, it's I can see how it's probably served its purpose very well since that redesign actually occurred. But yeah, I mean, I do have some suggestions maybe to really, if there are any areas where I thought maybe there could be some improvement, it was maybe just to make it slightly more kind of self-explanatory. Because of course, as you know better than I do, this is a new chart type to a lot of people,
Yeah.
and the faster that we can kind of get them up to speed so they understand it with as little explanation as possible, kind of the better, right? All right, so yeah, we have kind of that current design that you were just showing on the left here. and a redesign that I came up with, and kind of gave you a bit of a preview. Thought that maybe it was sort of worth that we're talking about, but I wanted to kind of tackle it in steps. And so if we kind of start with that, that original design, like I said, there's not a lot that's wrong with this, but really, so the question is, can we maybe improve it so that it requires kind of less explanation?
Yeah, yeah.
And so one of the things that I kind of suggested is maybe even just for the typeface, the font. I just chose one that was kind of sans serif. So serifs are the little kind of feet at the ends of the characters that you see in fonts like Times New Roman, for example. And so there is some evidence that actually people who have dyslexia, for example, find sans serif fonts like Helvetica and Arial, for example, slightly easier to read. And they are maybe slightly more legible. In the case of charts, it's different for like text. Like if you're reading a novel or something, it's a bit different than when you're reading individual kind of blocks of numbers and things like that in a chart. So I tend to use sans serif fonts and or typefaces more specifically in my charts. And I also actually slightly lightened them. I tend to almost never use 100% black in charts and just trying to avoid sort of high contrast in all cases. But 100% black versus 100% white, it's a little bit easier to read if this is actually kind of a sort of a dark charcoal gray, essentially. Very, very minor detail, of course, but
No, but they you can see the impact they have as you apply them.
And then because essentially there are no grid lines, any values that are kind of off to the right here on the right-hand side of the chart are just going to be slightly harder to visually estimate because they're kind of far from that quantitative scale over here on the left. And so it's another change. I typically put grid lines in most of the charts that I create, but very, very, very faint, right? They're not the most important part of the chart. They're the least important part of the chart. And so that makes it just a little bit easier to visually estimate values that are out here that are further from the quantitative scale. I also remove the y-axis line. You can leave it there. Like I said, it's not a huge problem or anything, but I tend to remove it simply because it's actually really not doing anything. And your eye kind of sort of paints a line there anyways. There's kind of a sort of a gestalt effect. Like I said, these are all very kind of minor improvements, but it's just typically what I do kind of in my own charts. And if I look at the time scale down at the bottom here, it's a little bit tricky to read because there's a bit of ambiguity in terms of like for the year label, is that labeling the beginning of the year, the middle of the year? Not quite sure. And then there's also the fact that it's, kind of vertical, which is certainly not the end of the world, but there's a little bit more cognitive effort required if you're reading essentially non-horizontal text. And so most of the charts that I create with timescales, I use what's called a multi-level timescale. And so now you have this kind of horizontal text. There's no vertical text, and it's sort of clear where the divisions are between the years, and you can even see the actual sort of quarter markers if that's important, right? Now, it may or may not be important to actually identify specific individual quarters, especially for a long period of time like this. And so if that's the case, you can just omit them, right? But then it's still kind of clear where the beginning of and the end of each year actually is. But let's assume that that is important, and you would need to include the actual quarters. Depends on the situation, right?
Yeah, it does.
And of course, this approach works regardless of timescale, right? You could have days over months, you could have seconds over minutes, you could have years over decades, and it's basically going to work the same way. And sometimes I'll even have more than two levels, right? You can have days over months over quarters, for example, depending on how much kind of precision you actually need. And so I just added some outliers here to the raw data just for illustrative purposes, so we can kind of show what outliers might look like. And so I suggested actually two things here. One would be to mark off the outliers so that they draw attention, of course. And then so that they even pop out a little bit more, I'm suggesting to actually remove the markers for kind of the normal values, just so that it just makes the chart a little bit cleaner looking. And, because they're normal, we don't care about them as much anyways, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd probably actually maybe kind of remove those as well. And it was interesting when I heard your kind of description of the rationale for having the two different hues, right? The gray and the blue. It's like, yeah, I could certainly sort of understand that, and it does make sense. But I mean, I guess maybe kind of a potential concern or consideration there is that it kind of almost makes this look like two completely different data series, right? We have the
Yeah,
gray data series and the blue data series. It's not really what's happening here, though.
that's
It's
right.
all actually one data series. These are just kind of different calculated values based on, but it's still all the same data, right? Like daily farm profit in US cents, like it says at the top
That's
there.
it.
Uh, and, and so there's a couple of things that I did here. One was to maybe, yeah, sorry, that's basically what I said. I was kind of out of sync with my comments there, but yeah, to maybe make it the same color, right? That central line a little thicker, right? So that it, is the thing that you notice, but it's basically saying this is the same data. It's just kind of a sort of a calculated value or summary value. It's based on that data. And because it is calculated rather than actuals, a convention that I typically use is to use dotted lines for calculated values or reference lines or targets or budgets or thresholds, that kind of thing. Anything that's not kind of actual data, I tend to make kind of a dashed line there. But now we still have this blue natural process range, which again, it's actually kind of based on the same data. So I might just change that to gray so that it's all gray essentially, like to show that this is the same data series essentially. It's not two different or separate data series. And it also kind of maybe actually to your kind of point that you made when you were describing XMR charts, we don't want people to pay too much attention to the line that's happening inside of the natural process range. And so by making it sort of gray on gray, the idea was that, hopefully in ADA anyways, you'll notice that gray line a little bit less, and you'll notice it more when it exits the natural process range. I mean, here it's kind of hard to see because the outliers don't grow up very much. But if this was like really a lot higher, then ideally, anyways, you would notice that a little bit more. Now, one of the things I talk about in my dashboard course is that there are basically three different kinds of metrics, right? Like there are kind of higher is better metrics like this, right? Presumably we want more daily farm profit, uh, and so if that's the case, we might want to make that a little bit more visually obvious that essentially anything that sort of goes above the natural process range, we would hopefully anyways consider that to be a good thing. And anything that goes below, is a bad thing. And so it's a little visual cue that basically says this is a kind of metric where higher numbers generally are more desirable. But that's not always the case. If we had something like daily farm expenses, well, then it's kind of the opposite, right? If it goes high, then that's actually bad. And if it goes low, then that's good. And so then we want to basically kind of invert the color. So now our red line is up here instead of at the bottom, and our green line is down here instead of at the top.
This has
And so I could
been
see this maybe being, sorry, go ahead.
this has been one of the more common comments that pump users make about the XMR charts is when they put them in a dashboard, it's difficult for them to figure out which direction is good and bad. So without even having to add extra symbols or explanations, this visual cue just does it immediately.
Yeah, yeah, and I have these conversations too in my dashboard course where we're going to have at least on kind of what I call a tactical monitoring dashboard. You're going to have a lot of numbers on it, and it can be hard to kind of change gears. Think, oh, I wanted higher numbers for this, but lower numbers for that. And so, yeah, this kind of visual cue might help to kind of accelerate that processing. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's actually a third kind of metric, which I call a Goldilocks metric or Goldilocks KPI, which is basically where we want the actual value to basically be as kind of close as possible to an ideal value, or at least to stay within an ideal range. And we don't want it to go above or below that ideal number or ideal range. And so in this case, you would just have two limiter lines, right? You have a red one above and a red one below, indicating that basically deviation either above or below that kind of desired range is going to be undesirable. Well, let's say you stick with kind of a higher is better metric, like daily farm profit, for example. We want higher numbers there. I'll just use that for illustration purposes. Now, probably something like 4% of the people watching this video are very mad at me right now because this is not colorblind safe. And they're seeing no difference between the upper dotted line and the lower dotted line. And so if you have colorblind users, then it's pretty simple to make this kind of colorblind friendly, just basically change the green to blue. And then people with the most severe forms of colorblindness are going to see the difference. What I actually recommend in my dashboard course is that you actually include an option somewhere at the top of the dashboard, like if it's in an interactive medium, like Tableau or even Excel, where, a checkbox or something, it says use colorblind safe colors. And then you would switch from red green to blue gray or blue red, for example.
Yep.
And then sometimes people say, well, why don't we just always use blue and red? And the answer is that it's just not as intuitive for people who have normal color vision, right? And we're like, if you show a chart like this to somebody, you might have to explain to them that blue is good and red is bad. Whereas if it's green and red, you don't typically have to explain anything unless they're in certain parts of Asia where red has a different meaning. But, let's assume that, your audience is in more kind of, I guess, Western part of the world. And so if you have that toggle at the top where you show red, green by default, but then the user can switch to, red, blue instead, optionally, that kind of gives you the best of both worlds. It's a bit more work, but, like I said, best of both worlds. Sorry for the interruption. This is Editor Nick. Unfortunately, we lost the high quality video recording of our conversation at this point. And so I'm going to have to switch to a lower quality backup, but you should be able to still hear the conversation clearly between Stacey and I. Proceed. Like I said, best of both worlds. But let's stick with maybe sort of red and green for now. And I wanted to sort of have a closer look at this target indicator. And so, of course, once you explain to somebody that that's what this is, that's what this means, then it's easy, right?
Yep.
But again, in the interest of trying to minimize that explanation, I was wondering, can we actually make this look more like a target so somebody could even guess what it means correctly, even without an explanation? And so I thought of maybe doing something like this, right? So we have this kind of target looking sort of radical shape, which it would be worth testing just to see, like, do people actually recognize this as
Yeah.
representing a target? I suspect probably in most cases they would.
Yeah.
And so if we just have a central line target, we make that gray because that's what the central line is. It's gray. As you mentioned, though, you might also have targets for the lower and upper, process limits. And so if we had those, you could just basically use the colors that we established with those dotted red and green lines to indicate targets for those as well.
I really like that, Nick. I like that they're little target symbols. I think that is going to be much more intuitive. But I like that they're color matched to the parts of the XmR chart, because one of the biggest risks, I guess, of using these charts is people are so used to looking at thresholds and thinking that outside the threshold range or above it or whatever is good or bad. And that's not what an XmR chart's doing. It's telling us where the process currently is. And with the addition of these color-coded targets, we can see that, no, that's not how we interpret it. Sure, up is a good direction for this one. Down is a bad direction. But where we really want it to be is up where those target values are. So we can visualize where that upper limit should be with that green target, where the lower limit should be, and where we want. Well, by the way, the central line target always be halfway between the upper and the lower, because the upper and lower are always equidistant from the central line. Oh, I can't believe we let that slip through, Nick. I only just noticed it then. But yeah, I love this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, based on the math, it will always be in the center. Yeah, I should have thought of it as well, but yeah, maybe I can change that in the edit.
Otherwise, it's just a little detail, no problem.
Yeah. So then for the next kind of design suggestion, I just removed the outliers for illustrative purposes, so I could basically show a long run. And then this is how, as I understand it, it's shown kind of typically in the XmR charts that you use in your course. But again, I was asked, well, is there a way that we can kind of make it more visually obvious what this highlight actually means? Like, why is there a red box around these values? And I personally am, I'm not afraid to put these kinds of direct explanations straight into the charts, right? Tell people 8 consecutive quarters above the central line. That's why these are being highlighted, so they don't have to
Yeah.
look it up in a legend or an annotation or something. It's just right kind of there in the chart. And so then, of course, if we adjust the central line based on that long run, then of course the range is the range natural process range shifts. And so I'm also kind of a pretty big fan of putting key observations, insights, recommendations directly in chart titles as well. We kind of chatted a little bit about this before. It sounds like you're
Yeah,
also kind of a fan of doing this.
I really am.
Like, don't leave the audience guessing why you're showing them this information. They might disagree with it. Sometimes I get that comment in workshops. So I say, well, what if people have a different interpretation of this data? That's fine. Then you sit down and talk about it and try to, get on the same page, because clearly you're kind of viewing reality in two different ways. And so it's kind of a cue that says that there needs to be kind of a conversation around there. But 9 times out of 10, you're just saving them cognitive effort, right? They don't have to, they basically see what the key takeaway or recommendation is right away, uh, without having to sort of decode the chart.
Well,
And even
that's
putting,
both of those points are really important, that you made there, Nick, is that A, if everyone agrees with it, they've arrived at a shared understanding rapidly. If not
Mhm,
everyone agrees with it, it's triggered the exact right conversation they should be having, the chart.
right.
So I think both of those are exactly what we would want to have.
Yeah, yeah, and I get that comment all the time, like I said, in my dashboard course, as well. Could even highlight, if there's a particular, like this headline, daily farm profit increase immediately in Q2 2012. Well, then might as well highlight Q2 2012, so the user doesn't have to go in the chart and try and kind of look it up based on the time scale. We just draw attention to it right there. If there is a particular part of the chart that is of particular interest, for whatever insight it is that we're trying to communicate. I noticed that in the current design, the description, the detailed description of the metric is not actually in the chart itself. It's either above it or like in a annotation below or something like that. Uh, and so I typically will actually put that straight into the chart itself, right? I'll actually put it right beside the y-axis to basically say, you know, this text refers to these numbers, essentially.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's not a big leap for people to do that on their own. They're going to figure it out, but it's just saving kind of a small cognitive step for that. And as I'm sure you tell people as well, of course, we want to be very descriptive, very wordy in these descriptions, so people understand exactly what these numbers represent. If it's something like this, which is, I don't know, 14 words or something, that's actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, because then there is no ambiguity about what these numbers actually are, how they're calculated, where they came from, whatever is necessary for people to never misinterpret what this number actually is. And so
100%.
that's kind of my final redesign.
And it's powerful. Like I think I kind of prefaced this with this idea of how could we make that XMR chart design 2.0 even better fulfill the XMR's purpose. And I think you've done it in several ways. I mean, it's definitely still very visually appealing. We've added more power to color as a layer of information meaning in here, particularly with that immediate cue about which direction's good and which direction's bad. It's just a lot of people say, shouldn't every PI be calculated in a way that a bigger number is better? But that's just not practical. And we don't need that restriction in how we measure. So this
No, no, and I
solves
can
that,
see
I
that
think.
being really confusing too. Like, if you're talking about something like expenses, like, what are you gonna show, like, like
Yep,
negative expenses? Or are you gonna have, like,
exactly.
0 at the top and then the scale counting down? Yeah, like,
It's
that could get real confusing real fast, yeah.
absolutely. And I think also reducing the risk of how these charts can be misinterpreted. You've achieved that as well by having those target color coded, color matched target values off to the side there. I I think that when graphs are presented, usually some kind of commentary has to go with them to help people figure
Yeah,
out what the graph is really saying to them.
agreed, agreed.
And when you put that on the chart in the appropriate places, succinctly but with enough detail to get the real point across, we've just saved space, we've saved effort. The eye doesn't have to flick up and down looking at the graph, reading the text, looking back up at the graph. It's all there. So,
Yeah.
as far as I'm concerned, Nick, this really has met that wish to make these charts just speak more and speak more clearly.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I do get objections when I say things like, "Well, we should put these kinds of insights, for example, like directly in the chart." And people say, "Oh, well, that's kind of, we're adding our own interpretation. We're gonna bias the audience's interpretation of the data." But I mean, this is part of a much larger discussion. But I don't think it's even theoretically possible to create a chart that just shows the data, right? All of your design choices are based around the reason why you felt that the audience needed to see that information in the first place. And so you might as well tell them. And as we were talking about before, if they disagree, then that's actually important information.
Was it Deming that said data has no meaning apart from its context?
Uh, it could be. I know the quote, but I'm not sure of the source. So,
So,
yeah.
but that's this kind of saying is you can't just show data. You need to show the context within which we are trying to use that data to get
Yeah,
more
it's not
information or
even
more insight.
it's not even theoretically possible. Like if you just designed a chart without any particular objective in mind, you will end up communicating random insights. It's
Yeah.
probably not going to work out very well. The audience is going to be like, what is this?
Yeah.
This is not useful to me.
This is this is something that we have as an advantage in this particular application, because what you're talking about, Nick, applies to any kind of data visualization at all. What we're talking about here is XMR charts for the purpose of monitoring KPIs or performance
Of
measures. We
course,
have a
yeah, yeah.
very specific purpose, a very
True,
specific context, and that
true.
makes what you've done just all the more powerful because it matches that purpose and context so very well.
Great. Well, I'm glad that it's of use.
It absolutely is. I'm going to immediately start switching to this format of XMR chart at the very least, just to see how I respond to it. And I know that we will have heaps of pump followers that are keen to play with this as well. So I've got to get to and build at least an Excel template to produce these. But Nick, do you have any thoughts on how the other kind of off the shelf um, data and
Um,
analytics software can do this?
I don't think there's anything terribly kind of esoteric in terms of data visualization features. For example, these multi-level timescales, like we're seeing at the bottom here, are now fairly ubiquitous in most data visualization products. Sometimes with Excel, as you well know, you have to kind of hack it a little bit to get it to show like a moving
Yeah.
range like that. But it's certainly doable, and I don't think it would be terribly difficult in Power BI or Tableau. Power BI, I don't know. I mean, I'm always stunned at the limitations of the visualization in that particular product. So who knows? But there are people who I can ask who know Power BI and are able to do incredible things with it. So I might show this to them and see what they can come up with.
That'd be interesting because one of my other I guess associates in this space, Michelle Decker at Nova Silva, that his team had built an XMR chart part or tool within Power BI because the XMR charts are just not a common thing in a lot of the sort of more automated approaches to data viz and dashboarding. So it'd be interesting to see what they think and whether they could incorporate some of this design into their Power BI tool. Yeah, I think we've got lots of potential here for really stepping up the use of these charts in decision making, making it easier for everyone to use them and more excited to use them too, because I'm sure everyone watching this can see just how quickly you can get quite a lot of information from just one simple, beautiful visualization. So Nick, thank you
Yeah.
so much. This has been a lot of fun and just so worthwhile.
Great. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'm interested to see people um, start using it. Be kind of neat.
We'll see for sure. Thanks, Nick.
All right. Thanks.